Ladies and gentlemen, the Algerian military has got to go. The power and success of Algeria's year-long peaceful protest movement makes this very clear. It shows that the Algerian people are now more than ready to step up and take their country into the next era. The military's role in Algerian history passed the point of diminishing returns a long time ago, and it is now placing the military's own accomplishments in grave jeopardy. In my first video on the country 9 months ago, I pointed out that Algeria had to fight much harder for its independence than any other North African country. In my reading since, it's become clear that the Algerian military did a lot more than just win that fight. It also defined Algeria as a nation. Unlike its neighbors, Tunisia and Morocco, Algeria does not have a long history as a unified country. Instead, its status as the borderland between a succession of empires left it fragmented. In the many centuries between the early years of the Abbasid Caliphate and the French invasion, Algeria was never unified for long. It was almost always divided up between empires to the east and west. Some of these empires were based in Morocco or Tunisia, both of whom have the nation-making ancient capital cities and centers of Islamic learning that Algeria lacks. Algeria was the most distant province of the Ottoman Empire, but Turkish control never made it that far from the coast, and Algeria's second biggest city, Oran, was controlled by the Spanish for most of the time between 1500 and 1800. Like Ukraine or the Balkans, Algeria spent centuries as a battleground between competing empires. This is why the country was so susceptible to French imperial influence. There was never a unified political unit to fight against the Europeans, the way there was in Morocco or Tunisia. Don't get me wrong, there were great Algerian resistance heroes like Abd el-Qadir, a guy who was world famous enough to have a town in Iowa named after him in the 1840s, but he saw himself as more of a religious figure than a national political one. Over 132 years of control, the French used their advanced industrial and military technology to consolidate the vast territory of modern Algeria into one political unit, subject to the capital of Algiers, probably for the first time in human history. But the country the French built wasn't an Algerian one. Though Europeans were probably never more than 1/10 of the population, they were often the majority in the coastal cities. The language of government, business, and urban life itself was French. This was the challenge Algerians faced at the beginning of their War of Independence. When the Algerian military started in 1954, according to legend, with just 50 shotguns, it didn't just have to win Algeria's independence. In a very real sense, it had to build the country's national culture and history from the ground up. The Revolutionary Army itself, for the duration of the conflict, primarily spoke French. The Algerian government, for years after independence, had to keep on using the language of the imperialists. The Algerian bureaucrats simply lacked the relevant Arabic vocabulary. So Algeria's military didn't just kick out the French in one of the bloodiest independence wars of the 20th century. After victory in 1962, and especially after a coup in 1965, the Algerian military also charted a course of fierce independence. That thirst for independence became Algerian identity. Everybody wanted to profit from their revolutionary success, from Nasser of Egypt to the competing communist regimes of Russia and China to the United States. Algeria played all of these wannabe patrons off of each other, successfully maintaining the country's freedom of action. As the decades wore on, thanks to Saudi Arabia and the CIA, world revolution took on a more radical Islamist vibe, and Algeria's military shook that outside influence off as well in a savage civil war in the 1990s. I am not sure it was worth it. The more I learn about the Algerian Civil War in the 1990s, the more horrified I get. In the late 1980s, jockeying for position between military factions combined with a plummeting oil price and a mass protest movement to produce a real attempt at multi-party democracy. When it became clear that these new elections were going to be won by an Islamist party, the competing factions in the military unified, got together to force the democracy-friendly president to resign and cancel those elections. They argued that they had to do it to preserve Algeria's secular nature, and maybe they were right, but the cost was truly horrific. Throughout the dark decade of the 1990s, the Algerian people were stuck between two buzzsaws. The Islamist party that had its victory stolen dissolved into warring factions that believed in differing levels of violence to get their way. While the military regime stayed unified publicly, under the surface it was a mess of assassinations and violent factional conflict that used various Islamist groups as pawns against each other. Some believe that many of the war's most horrific massacres, supposedly carried out by religious radicals, were in fact carried out by the regime itself to discredit political Islam. This horrific nightmare of a decade killed at least 150,000 people. You can make an argument that this violent blocking of the Saudi-inspired Islamist tendency of the 1980s was kind of good for Algerian independence. The Civil War meant that when a protest movement finally emerged in Algeria, a decade later than the rest of the Arab world, it was fiercely committed to peaceful organizing and keeping out outside influence. This has meant that the protest movement in Algeria has been a lot more successful than it has been in some other countries. But for me, it's harder to argue that this happy result was worth the tragedy of the 1990s. This is what I mean when I talk about the diminishing returns of Algeria's military regime. The Civil War is now very much a part of Algeria's heritage of fierce independence. But yikes. Another negative regime development of the 1990s was the new prominence of France-aligned generals. Some go so far as to believe that in the waning days of the Independence War back in the 1960s, the French trained a bunch of Algerian officers who faked a defection to the Algerian cause. The theory claims that these young officers then slowly took over the Algerian government in a sinister 30-year plot. I think the strong version of this theory is more than a little ridiculous, but it's based on a surprising but sensible choice that the Algerian military regime made in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. There were a group of Algerian defectors that came over from the French army towards the end of the Independence War. And they did move up in the military because of their professionalism and expertise. But this wasn't some sinister French plot. It was the result of a wise strategic decision made by the Algerian leadership. People forget what a dangerous place the world was before the end of the Cold War. Once the independence issue was settled, France was a good, weak power to latch onto. Unlike the superpowers, France desperately needed Algerian oil, and a close relationship with the old imperial power was more likely to be a partnership than the neo-colonialism the United States and the Soviet Union were offering. The relationship with France gave Algeria the breathing room it needed to chart its own path. The Algerian people and government now speak vastly more Arabic and Amazigh than French. There's still a lot of French influence at the top, but by almost any measure, Algeria is vastly more independent than it was 50 years ago. So I can't bring myself to condemn the legacy of the Algerian military regime entirely. To do that would be to condemn Algeria itself. But it is long past time for that military to get out of Algerian politics. The high level of French corruption is just one of many reasons why. The best reason for the military to get out of politics is the protest movement itself. The responsibility, peacefulness, and simple common sense demands of the Hirak movement make their case for real democracy indisputable. The protesters are often criticized for a lack of unified leadership, but whenever somebody tries to step up, the regime throws that person in jail, so that's not a particularly fair criticism. Just because the Algerian regime is not murdering as many people as it used to, does not mean that Algeria is all of a sudden a free country. There's a lot more work to do. Another reason the Algerian military regime needs to go is time itself. I'd been aware that Abdelaziz Bouteflika, the president overthrown by the protesters last April, was one of the last of the revolutionary generation, but I had assumed he was some young foot soldier back then. Not so. He was a major player, serving as foreign minister from the mid-1960s. This guy took meetings with people like Khrushchev and de Gaulle, yet he was still in power at the beginning of 2019, more than half a century later. That's insane. After Bouteflika's fall, the military consolidated power behind Ahmed Gaid Salah, a guy who became the new nemesis of the protesters. He organized elections for a new puppet president. And then he died of a heart attack because he was 79. The parallels between the Algerian regime and the final years of the Soviet Union should be jumping out at you right now. Another reason for the regime to go is oil and gas. We've been living in a post-scarcity world for petroleum products for about 5 years now. Folks are now waking up to the fact that this isn't going to be changing anytime soon. Algeria's status as a petrostate allowed it to paper over a lot of cracks for a very long time. As the protest movement demonstrates, the military can't afford to bribe the people anymore. And it's going to get worse. Algeria built up a large cushion of foreign reserves over the course of the good years. That cushion is quickly evaporating. Algeria has a lot of hard choices to make in the coming years, and the military won't be able to make them. The cushy bubble of corruption they used to make the country work is now popping. Bailing out now is just the sensible thing to do. There's another country in North Africa whose nation was built by its army. That's Egypt. From the 19th century until Nasser's humiliation of the British in the 1950s, the Egyptian military led the way to independence and modernity. But then it held on to power long enough to kill its own success. Egypt's military dug into the economy and became an enthusiastic torturer and murderer of its own people. Egypt's military took the country from the status of an international power broker and the leader of the Arab world and turned it into a place that is widely pitied as a tool of the United States with a stagnant economy that can barely feed itself. Egypt should provide a cautionary tale to Algeria's military. They should get out of politics while the getting's good. The Algerian people will thank them for it. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and come back next time when we will talk about the quickest way to reduce French influence in Algeria, opening up the border with Morocco. Thanks.